Chapter 5 Josephine Howell's parents had lived in a small house halfway between the Weavers' farm and Morris Emmons' store, but that was long before either of those latter places existed. The house burned down with Joe's parents in it when Joe was 8 years old. The child, already stout, which was remarkable in an area where children of farmers more commonly suffered from malnutrition, was out picking pecans off the ground in a neighboring orchard at the time. Pecans sold for 5 cents a pound in pine cone, but they were proved much more valuable to little Josephine in that they preserved her life. The cause of the fire was never known, though it must be admitted that it was never really looked into either. After this accident, little Josephine went to live with her only surviving relative, Balma, a second cousin, twice removed, who was old, infirm, and most people said insane. Joe was 16 when the old woman drowned in the burnt corn creek in her 87th year. No one could determine what the old woman had been doing down there on the bank, since she had always maintained to anybody who would listen how much she hated and feared running water. No one, however, much regretted her passing, and many were even relieved, for Josephine's cousin had been a spiteful woman who kept grudges against the third generation of a family that had wronged her. She was poor, physically almost helpless, and had possessed no real influence in the scattered community of farmsteads, yet it was thought very bad luck to be on the wrong side of her. This bad luck was a very corporal thing and would manifest itself into loathsome boils and ulcerations of the skin at best, and the worst was evidenced in sudden violent death. But Alabama was a backward place then, where loathsome skin diseases and sudden violent deaths were not an uncommon phenomenon anyway. Before the meager wooden headstone had been raised on the old woman's grave, Joe had married Jimmy Howell, a young dirt farmer who didn't know what he wanted out of life and wasn't smart enough to realize that what he wanted most certainly didn't want was a wife like Josephine. Even when she was young and she married when she was no more than 17, Josephine Howell was both large-boned and fat. It was a shape ill-suited for the hard life of a spouse of a dirt farmer. Jimmy Howell had raised cotton while a bachelor, but Josephine complained so much of the difficulty in stooping to work with the plants that he had switched over to corn, though it was a less profitable concern. Josephine would have refused to work the farm altogether had she not realized that her effort was absolutely necessary for their economic survival. She had not wanted children, had no wish for the bother of raising and caring for them, but after 17 years of marriage, she had given her husband a son, not to please Jimmy Howell, but to provide a worker for the farm. Joe raised Dean with one object in mind, that he should take her place in the field, and before 5 years had elapsed, Dean had proved himself a already better, more valuable worker than his mother. Joe retired in triumph to her kitchen for a radio until Jimmy Howell died. Then she took the insurance money and the scant proceeds from the sale of their 40-acre farm. It had increased from 30 acres in their 35 years of marriage, and purchased a small house in Pine Cone, one that was old but still in fair condition. It had been one of the first to be built in the south of Commercial Boulevard. Joe had wanted a new house but could not afford it. The whole of her life, she grumbled, had been like that. It was sometimes said in places where farmers gathered that Josephine Howell had driven her husband to an early grave with her sullen temper, her constant complaining, her intractable laziness, just so that when he was dead, she could sell the farm and move into Pine Cone, where she wouldn't have to do anything but grow fatter than she already was, if that was possible. The problem was that she had to wait until Dean was old enough to support her so that she wouldn't have to do any work at all. The wives of these farmers whispered that her means of disposing of her husband had not been of the legal variety, but this has to be discontinued as malicious gossip. It was well known that Jimmy Howe had died of a snake bite, though the doctor couldn't tell exactly what kind it had been, and no one had seen the reptile. 2 fang marks were found on the dead man's leg just above the ankle, and it was very likely that he'd been bitten in the field. Mal Homans was a farmer who owned acreage immediately adjoining that of Jimmy Howe, and whenever the story was repeated, Zhao invariably said, "I think it was Joe Howe put them marks on Jimmy's leg with her own teeth, in that it was poison out of her own mouth that killed him, except that she was too fat to bend down that far." Joe Howe paid no attention to what people said. She and her teenage son lived quietly together in the small house, and much the greatest portion of Dean's minuscule salary went to keep them in food. At this time, Dean was much oppressed by his mother and wanted desperately to leave her, though he knew that if he did, she would be forced to go on welfare. Dean wed Sarah Bascom, much against his mother's wishes, but this attempt to be free of Joe was a failure. Sarah was not fond of her mother-in-law, but she insisted that Dean not abandon the woman altogether. When he lost his job and the trailer was seized by the bank, Dean with his bride reluctantly returned to the house that belonged to his mother. To Joe's credit, she ignored the fact that he had treated her shabbily in the previous months. On the other hand, she did not treat Sarah any more kindly, though she knew that her daughter-in-law had stood up for her cause with Dean. Dean and Sarah had been living in the second bedroom on the house at the time that he was drafted, and now Joe was alone with Sarah. It was common knowledge that Joe Howe did not get along with her daughter-in-law, and that the household was not a cheerful one. It was Sarah who invariably pitied and in fact admired for putting up with Joe Howe's harsh ways. Not only did Sarah work very hard to bring money into the household, had for a time supported both her husband and his mother, but she waited on Joe Howe as well, performed all sorts of little services for that fat, lazy woman who sat around the house all day long watching television and eating Ritz crackers. Every afternoon at 5:30, when Sarah Howe returned from Pinecone Munitions Factory, she found Joe Howe sitting in the rocking chair in their simply furnished, dusky living room. The sun was going down on the other side of the house, and the principal light in the room was from the television set. Joe usually preferred to be absorbed in the late afternoon movie or whatever actress happened to be talking to Michael Douglas, so that she wouldn't have to speak to her daughter-in-law. But on one afternoon, late in March, Joe Howe, the remote, turned off the set as soon as Sarah came in the door. Sarah knew something was up, and she could not hear the television. Sarah put the groceries down on the counter and went directly to Joe. The woman sat in her accustomed chair, grimly smiling. Sarah distrusted the woman, who had never any liking for her and actually hated the way she looked, oily and gross, with streaked greasy hair pulled hard back from her face. Joe's eyes were small and black, and loose flesh almost closed over them, especially when she looked hard at you. "Hey, Joe," said Sarah, and tried not to show the apprehension that she felt. But there was no sense in antagonizing Joe before she even knew what the matter was. Their argument would come soon enough, but sometimes Sarah put a cheerful face before it all. She was allowed to get one through an entire evening easily enough, and these days with Dean gone, she really didn't ask for much more than that. Joe replied nothing at all, but stared at her daughter-in-law. Sarah sighed, then a small sigh fell into the small corner of the couch with a mixture of fatigue, curiosity, and patience. "Sarah," began Joe very slowly. Sarah was glad that she didn't own a dog, because Joe looked as if she were about to inform her that it had just been run down in the road. "What, Joe?" Army called Sarah. Joe was holding on to every word. "What the Army want with you?" said Sarah, trying, not able to match her mother-in-law's sullen deliberateness of tone. "Wasn't me they wanted to talk to you." "What they want, Joe? I got to go put up the groceries." Sarah wanted Joe to get on with this. It wasn't that she was worried about anything that Joe might have to say. She just didn't want to give Joe the satisfaction of keeping her guessing. keeping her in suspense. It was one of Joe's favorite games and one of the most exasperating. "Dean's coming home." "Why?" said Sarah involuntarily in her surprise. "Why is he coming home now? He's got leave 3 weeks ago, and I didn't think he could get it again so soon," he said. Joe interrupted her. "Dean's coming home for good." Sarah moved her hand in a slight protest, and she gazed on Josephine Howe with annoyance and apprehension.